questions that come into my head too. So it's a great comment.
There are multiple points here. The first one is we did not assume that everything within 200 kilometers is the same. We included everything within 200 kilometers, and their contribution was 1 over their distance. So a plant that's 200 kilometers away contributes 1 over 200. A plant that's 1 kilometer away contributes 1. It's like 200 times what the contribution is. That's the second one. The second point is the direction the wind blows. If you do that, your study is investigating the effect of airborne radionuclides. Does not investigate the association with proximity. That means you are already assuming a specific exposure pattern. That covers all of it. If it was going through water, would it go with the wind direction? No. If it was going with food that grows next to areas with plants and people eat it, would go with the wind direction? No. But one proxy, which is distance, can act as a rough proxy for all of these. Are stronger with wind, associations are stronger with groundwater movement, associations are stronger with surface water movement, or with how food is being sourced. So these are again valid questions, but they are for a different.
If not, then I'll.
The two of you, there seems to be a dichotomy between what you're talking about in terms of radiation exposure. Because if it's coming from a medical source, that is controlled, specific, it is for a brief period of time that is determined beforehand, and anybody who's the information, because as far as I'm concerned, you're talking apples and oranges here.
I agree. When I started, I thought part of the pushback from like health physicists is we speak different languages, considering radiation impacts. I put a lot of stock in, there's something called the million-person study that is ongoing that's looking at and looking at do they individual characteristics in the dose those people receive. Dr. Alwadi told me he thought it was done recently, but I think radiation, you look at the exposure level and you look to see if the severity or the frequency they use in epidemiology, but in exposure here is distance and exposure. Mathematical definition. Same team, we're trying to keep people safe from radioactivity.
If there is an association or an effect through this specific pathway, what if there was through any other pathways? You can't see it, but distance can.
You know, when you're contemplating any one mechanism that doesn't have similar characteristics to one that we
and Mr. Monette examine what makes San Onofre one of the worst seismic activity, including seismic activity, sea level rise, saltwater corrosion, and long-term containment challenges. Our panelists for this panel include James Day, geochemist at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Kim McCoy, oceanographer and author, and David Weissman, former executive director of the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility. Moderating is Dr. Mike Pasqualetti, professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. Please welcome our panel on stage.
Well, I'm glad to be here. It's the extra added attraction is that it went 50 degrees less than when I left Phoenix. So for the 50 minutes I was flying to get here, it was a degree per minute. Temperature. You wonder why people live there. I can't answer that with any intelligence. We're going to do this a little bit differently because each one of us has a little bit of a presentation. And so I want to be able to allow those people to look at the screen when we're talking. We do have kind of a very illustrious group of panelists here, and I want to give them all a chance to talk at some length if they want to. What I'm going to do, though, as someone who just was folded into this role within the last 5 days, and only moderating, and I said, "What did you do there?" And she said, "Well, I can't tell you." So she's not working there anymore. She's locating cell towers now, so I'm not quite sure what that means. But you can see that this San Onofre was right on the cover of a book I did in 1990. I was interested in energy and land use conflicts, and so I've done a lot of work on decommissioning, but also in renewable energy and all the other. And I see these people who are not worried. They're just kind of sitting here on the beach. Published just a couple of months ago an energy policy where I asked the question, what are you going to do with the land after the power plants are dismantled? And believe me, in this country, there's no. And so I'm just, and because I'm not really one of the scheduled panels is operating, this is where they're storing the high-level waste now. Rancho Seco, which is up in California, which shut down early. This is one of my arguments. First of all, the power plants on Long Island never even operated. You still got the land to deal with. And the Rancho Seco shut down 20 years before its license. All these things come up faster than you think. Well, I go back to Rancho Seco. They put a huge array of solar there. They also put a gas fire for dumping off the water. The cooling towers is now a recreational lake. And over here, Duane Arnold, they put in solar to do with it. So there's a lot of these power plants around, and nobody has anything, any firm lease. And it's supposed to go back to the way it was before the power plant was here. Well, we'll see how that's going to work. Where are you going to put the waste that's already on? And of course, the infrastructure is there, so what's likely is that they'll put something else there that's generating electricity, whether it's a nuclear plant, a solar plant, a natural gas plant, or whatever. But has anybody given inside? Nobody was talking to say about this. Do you think that they're going to come out here and play around on a beach that was a nuclear power plant site? Do you think they're going to put a subdivision at the Palo Verde site, which is just 50 miles? No, they're just going to become permanent. Has anyone ever thought of that in advance? They haven't, and they also don't know what's happening afterward. Well, with that, I'm just going to introduce our training at Durham University. James, if you come up and here's your little clicker, you can go to your next one.
Understand how the moon formed. I study planet formation. So I'm going to come, typically provides energy for about 2 generations. And by generation, I mean around 20 years. Possibly as long. You take uranium-235, which is the isotope that enables fission to take place. And when you bombard it with neutrons, you produce a whole range of products that wouldn't typically occur in nature. These are the products we are discussing, okay? There is plenty of uranium-235 in the Earth still remaining. But it typically doesn't do very much. It produces that geothermal energy that Mark Jacobson was discussing. It's part of the heat source in the interior of our planet that produces that energy. So the questions we have to answer worth given those numbers, those basic numbers. Well, the issue also arises is where do you hindsight is 2020, but I would never have put a power plant in a place that is actually, and it's actually from Holmes et al. And This is just showing you some of the major earthquakes that have happened, magnitude 4 or larger, in the last 40 or so years. This is not the sort of place you would leave nuclear waste. You would not leave nuclear waste in a place like Yucca Mountain, which is just up here actually. It's on the Walker Lane fault system. A Miocene tuff volcanic deposit is mystifying, but it was. Parts of your nation. And the most geologically stable parts of the United States are actually in the northern states, Great Lakes region. Now, it's not my job to tell you how to get it there. It is my job to tell you. I would say probably more like
Thank you very much, James. Some years ago, I was on a panel that was to identify Mexico and there's four and to the website for 10,000 years. That was an interesting experiment. People away from inadvertent intrusion into the website for 10,000 years. And so we're talking about an oceanographer, an author, and we're going to be hearing about the impacts on a variety.
Mike, and let's see if we can, this is a very busy slide, but we're on the edge of an ocean, and I'm going to talk about radioactive waste and the global ocean. So here's Fukushima. Here's San Onofre. This is the Pacific. You see the pictures, or you look at a globe and you go, oh, Japan's far away. Well, actually, busy slide here. As James was talking before, we're in a seismic zone. It's capable, there are 2 fault systems here, each capable. Now, as James 5, that's new information. I think Driscoll and et al. Determined that. It's in a tsunami zone. People in Southern California Edison bravely say, oh, well, we're at 27 feet, excuse me. Okay, how do you know that? It hasn't happened yet, it hasn't been tested. That's Fukushima. It was obviously very destructive. Unstable geology in the coastline. It's a little bit hard to see, but here's Dana Point, here's San Onofre right here, and you can see how the continental slope just drops off there very rapidly. And well, this whole section right here is very capable of just slumping down. So slumping down in the chair, well, this whole section here could slump down. And Adam Young in Monterey, it's the tsunami zone actually juts in like and this whole thermal image 73, and then they're in containers. They're not in containers. They're not in inch, so about 6 millimeters in thickness, and they're about as hot as your micro oven. They're around They're around 500 C, 300 C about. The hook here, and it turns orange down there, is actually radiation measurement. Down there is actually radiation measurement that we made on the last day of July of this year, and we parked the car, walked up on the bluff, and then we walked down here. So here's along the beach. Here's up and walk down here. So here's along the beach. Here's up on the bluff. 12 times higher than the bluff. 12 times higher than the Department of Energy, recommended dose. That's not a pretty picture. This little slide here is high roughly, and look at this high roughly, and look at this It's absolutely amazing. There's nothing, it's absolutely amazing. There's nothing that's separating you other than this 100 feet, 30 meters. Large earthquake, this whole thing can subside, slide down. Now imagine if this whole thing can subside, slide down. Now imagine if this slipped 6 feet during the 1964, 10 meters. It dropped over 30 feet. Earthquake. So I've been around a little bit. So I used to be 6'6".
Very much, Jim. It's interesting that when I was doing that other study that I mentioned that we just published, we looked at in the tsunami zone. And so I asked them about that, and PG&E, of course, did a study. Sorry. David, if you would. Going to be speaking to us from as the former executive director of the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility. You're welcome, David.
Thank you all. I appreciate the chance to be here. Yes, former executive director. We're not, and we hear a lot of, and I heard the oohs and ahs, like when you hear those scary numbers about how much Chernobyl's, that's what we deal in, and how much this is going to cost. So you may hear, and there'll be further discussions today about solutions to this waste, and where can it go, and what can be done with it, and where discussions, but the question is, somebody's got to pay for it. No one's doing this for free for anybody. $7 billion. That's in 2014 dollars. The cost of building the plants was $5.1 billion. So it's costing nearly as but what I'll just point out is there are some fundamental flaws in their thinking. One, believe it or not, is in their estimate. They assume that the federal government will begin accepting San Onofre spent fuel nationally in the year 2030 or anything like that on the horizon in less than 8 years. And they believe, well, what's the problem with the cost here? And the answer is this. Sufficiently to kick in more money someday. Now, we've heard the word generations here and protecting for generations. Well, there's a concept at the California Public Utility, because they're the costs to invest on utilities of this state. And it's called intergenerational inequity. If they run out of the money to deal with whether this needs to be moved on the site or to a higher location, and future ratepayers have to pay, it means that 1 single watt of electricity while the plant was operating. So there's a with economics. So in addition to that, we have the California Coastal Commission. And the California Coastal Commission has a whole bunch of conditions that San Onofre has to come back and reinvestigate in 2028. And the Coastal Commission has been saying for quite some time. Well, in fact, here are their exact words. If the proposed storage must remain on site beyond 2051 for a long or an indefinite period of time, it may prove necessary to relocate the waste to another site within the SOM site to better be able to minimize hazards and assure the stability of the long-term storage. But again, what would be the cost of that? Where on the site could you possibly move it? And it turns out, Edison has not publicly identified might be. So we don't know what the cost would be to move it elsewhere on the site. We heard the Navy mentioned and the Navy lease. As far as the Navy's concerned, they want that land to look exactly like it looked before nothing was ever done there. They want the Marines to be able to practice storming the beaches there as they did before this plant was built. And in a 2019 letter from the Navy to Southern California Edison, they wrote, at this time, the Department of the Navy cannot provide definitive terms and conditions for the removal of the San Onofre substructure, seawall, or other features associated with the restoration of SOM's facility to its final end state. Those decisions will be made consistent with the terms of existing real estate instruments after careful evaluation when there is sufficient information to make such an evaluation. We heard those bluffs. They may very well want that to create a coastline that existed before. Not only that, the Navy has a problem with the fact that, as we heard, it's built on landfill. And to build a landfill, they had to put up coffer dams. They had to pump all the water out and then put all that solid infrastructure, steel girders and beams going down as much as 60 feet on which those reactor pads and footings stand. Well, the Coastal Commission would like those removed because they're very worried that with climate change and they don't call it erosion, by the way, the Coastal Commission. They refer to it as coastal processes. That's the phrase for erosion, but we don't talk about erosion. There are coastal processes afoot. As those things become, we want future beachgoers to stick a foot on a rusty piece of metal sticking out. Because as we heard, it's between the second most popular beach in the state of California. What will that cost? And the problem is, okay, well, who's going to pay? Well, we've already discussed, should it be ratepayers? And Pacific Gas and Electric and all the other utilities, including the Utility Reform Network, who would most assuredly mount a strong campaign against taking this from the ratepayers. Will Edison make their shareholders pay? Have they ever? And will this be covered by the Nuclear Waste Fund? Well, no, because this isn't creating a fine. So you really can't expect to take the money from there. And finally, well, maybe it comes from the Department of that fund that says, well, because the government defaulted on its 1982 promise to have a somewhere else forever place by 1998, they are paying, reimbursing utilities for the cost of on-site storage of spent fuel. It's not automatic. The utilities have to mount a case, they have to present evidence, and they don't get all the money they ask for. In fact, Edison's track record now is they get about 80% of the money they ask for. And so the question becomes, will that fund do it? Because the government could come back and say, well, wait a minute, the Coastal Commission told you back in 2015 to be careful of sea level change. Why did you not take and heed that advice then and build it somewhere higher? What, lawsuits and litigation. This is as much a financial problem as it also is a geological, a radiological, or a technological problem. And you know this, San Diego Gas and Electric, highest electric bills in the state of California. And part of that is because you are paying into this, with Edison very, very close behind on that. And it looks like, as with the waste itself,
what I'm worried about here. The panelists will come up and we'll just have a little. That includes you, David. Keep writing. So we had kind of economic discussion, we had a tsunami, water discussion, we had a geological discussion. None of us seen a truck that had at least 200 tires on it and this gigantic thing on top. And there was one guard sitting outside and there was a radiation warning sign on the side of his truck. As I went by and I said, I know what that is. They're taking San Onofre. And I said, well, I understand you have powder soap in San Onofre here. And they said, and who are you again? So I didn't get very far with that, but that's where they're putting it. This is about 70 miles west of Salt Lake before you get to the brothels in Wendover. And it's I was at Twilly Army Depot one time. Anyways, right next to Doug. That we should be addressing. How are we going to? Oh, I'll tell you one other thing. So why I'm mentioning this, because I'm not so proud of it. Graduate 20,000 people a year, but in that period of time, people come and they speak. And so Amy Levins came. Some of you know who he is, RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute guy. And 2 weeks before that was Jim Hansen, who was one of the first people to bring up this problem of global warming. And so I in favor of nuclear power, and he said, 2 weeks later, Lovins comes in, and I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I don't away because it did. I pointed out that there's more electricity produced, even though that uptick in solar is only in the last 5 or 6 years versus nuclear for 70 or 80 years. So it seems like if you just let things go. And this is one of the items that Mark Jacobson had talked about. And if you've read any of his work, you know that he is a very strong advocate of moving toward utility companies that are run by stockholders. Or software. Start with the cost of this. The power plants in England, which I've been following, they're putting in one right now near Bristol, and that thing is probably $38 billion or something like that. They're going to put another one in Sizewell. They're doing that now. I don't know that we're building any, but what is the financial cost that we're actually having to deal with here with regard to nuclear?
I expensive and not enough of them to go around to make a dent. And so I think apropos of today's situation, and people consider the back end of the problem. Whether it's even a small modular reactor, they haven't got a plan for what to do with that waste. Allison McFarland, who also, we have former Chair Yasko here today, so too we had former Chair of the NRC, Allison McFarland, had authored a paper with the National Academy of Science, and they've come up with the particular chemistry used in these small reactors, the radionuclide chemistry that would degrade that material very quickly. It's far more toxic to those containers. Well, here these people are advertising new technology. They're not talking about the back end of the situation. And that's why we are now paying, and may pay more, to build it. And I think that should be a requirement of all of these, that they must build in and tell people up front the back end.
What is that?
It's very vulnerable. Which is the study, Paleo Tsunami is studying the old 2.5 Mediterranean, over 100 meters high. So any geological pushes a lot of energy into the ocean. Start the process by which you could get a fracturing of one of those canisters, and if those end up in the surf zone because of a slump or other events, all those little tiny radioactive pellets would just be ground into sand. And then the aerosols would sweep throughout Southern California. And the current evacuation zone is 8 million people, including us right here. And there's no evacuation plan other than, I think they say, go to your car. And the tsunami is just one of the myriad of problems, not least of which is coastal stability and sea level rise, which would exacerbate any tsunami that happened.
So I live ASU is 53 miles from Palo Verde. And when I've had the health physicists come in and they say, well, we've got warning radius from Palo Verde of 50 miles. So I tell my students we're 53, so we're safe.
Another site is Turkey Point off the coast of Florida. It's about, I think it's and it has a cooling pool, and that water was not adequate to operate the nuclear power plant. So proximity, I think every single one. So
75 feet.
of those are in casks, which are much more impervious to events than the canisters at Senator Free.
And James, you mentioned back in the years when I was teaching physical geography, I was impressed by the fact that time, but talk about the seismic risks associated with that. What is the movement? I always heard that the San Andreas is moving about the pace of that your fingernails are growing. There has not been a huge earthquake on the San Andreas. 162, something like that. But there hasn't been anything close to a 7 down here that I know, or 7.5. So what do you see as the potential for seismic activity that could disrupt Palo Verde, San Onofre? What is the potential for those?
Yeah, I mean, the San Andreas fault system, most people think of the San Andreas as a single fault. It's not. The map I showed system, it runs offshore land, which has the Channel Islands. So the San Onofre power plant is sitting right in the middle of the San Andreas fault system. For quite some time. Very large earthquakes, 7.5, something like that. You know, these are very large earthquakes. There's, as Kim pointed out, there's a lot of mass waiting to fall, gravitational fall within. So having waste sitting right on the beach is a serious now, and you know, David could answer that question because he's the dollars guy. But the ultimate solution here, there are two answers to this problem. First is don't create more waste. Yeah. It's very simple. The second is the lines of wisdom are being adhered to.
Well, we're going to open it up to Q&A. Just yet a quick comment.
Yeah, I make an analogy for nuclear waste, sort of like a dog. Get rid of the.
So you're saying we should reactor poop in black bags?
Black bags, yes.
Yeah.
Simple. No one's thought of it.
Yeah, that's nice. The black bag. The black
Actually,
bag.
the Japanese put them in bags.
I saw that at Fukushima. They run out of space. Q&A. We got a few minutes here between now and lunch. Anyone have any questions they want to ask in terms of the safety? Okay, you. Here you go.
Thank you all so much, Carmen Valdez with Heal Utah. And I appreciate hearing about the effects of our oceans and faults and everything like that. And coming from Newport, we also have faults but no ocean. But there are increased fire risks, which California is a little aware to. I'm wondering if there are studies about what happens in the instance that these increased wildfire risks were to approach any of these nuclear facilities, either decommissioned existing waste plants, manufacturing different things like that, and what that means for our changing climate as well as affecting the ocean and the carbon.
All that now, and yes, so those, they have been studied it, they have done vegetation clearing. Yes, and reputable with their vegetation clearance. I would add they're actually convicted first.
It's in many cases, the lowering of the water table, which is intimately connected with the cooling process of many of those nuclear reactors. So it's a one system in the hydrological system, and the fires themselves wouldn't, in my opinion, wouldn't be too much of a problem, but the fact that you might have to shut down the power plant because of no water is another issue.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'm Alison St. John Inglis, and in view of the fact that Mike or Dr. Pasqualetti has seen radioactive materials being transported in dark of night to Clive, Utah, to hopefully buried, how can we be sure that the waste from San Onofre is not actually already being moved to places where it could be generating revenue for possibly weapons manufacture or plutonium or all of that? I just wonder, do we know that it's not going somewhere?
You don't want to trim?
Well, it's probably not going anywhere from the 73 because they don't know how to get those canisters out of the ground safely. And it's would be visually very obvious if they were taking those out. The horizontal ones they could probably do a little surreptitiously, but to my knowledge, there has been no recorded movement of any of the canisters out of the area.
No, they just taken the guts of the plane.
Well,
moving that.
Well, actually, most of the waste going out, and you see the rail cars there, is the concrete rubble. That is really the major component of the waste, is the concrete rubble. It's going to an Arizona dump. Because back when, yeah, that's what those rail cars are all going. There's a waste dump for this kind of rubbleized concrete.
That's why you have deserts.
In Arizona.
Deserts is dumps.
If you're interested in these kinds of things, I get it by email every 3 months. The NRC does their inspection report on the San Onofre decommissioning. They'll tell you, for example, in that report, yes, a truckload went out and someone was because they hadn't done the proper radioactive measurement on that truck on its way out. There's nothing against it. No one's dying from it. No one is getting killed. But you can get that information if you go to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's. Well, we'll ask Chairman Yasko to talk about the ATOM system at the NRC. Yourself up to receive these bi-monthly or quarterly reports on the actual inspection, what's going on, they test the rubble, etc. It's all of those reports.
So we've got an economic argument, we've got a tsunami argument, we've got a geologic argument. We haven't talked much about the equity issues except this intergenerational inequity. There's all that we're going to put in Yucca Mountain. Of course, most of that's going to come from east of the Mississippi. So then those people are not going to have to deal with their waste. It's going to be dumped in the west. Deserts is dumps once again. And so they all think that they can do that, and then they spend billions of dollars digging holes in Yucca Mountain. And then they find out other place. You know, my dog knows there's faults. I mean, there's faults all over Nevada. I mean, there's 100 fault-controlled mountain ranges, and then there's also a water connection between Yucca Mountain and Death Valley. Also in that area. So I'm just kind of wondering, is there anybody else before I get to anybody else? Anybody else? Yes, please.
No, just.
Yes, was you.
I appreciate your comment on the equity issue, but you know there are a lot of litigants of communities that are near different DOE weapons processing sites that have successfully litigated in the past, and you know we help them with the investment policy. But the key issue is that there are connections to groundwater everywhere you go, and there are connections to surface water by an awful lot of these facilities. So it's simple to say, hey, let's get it off the beach. And the other question is, whose ox? Whose ox will you gore, and where will you put it? And what about the rights of those communities? Typically, you know, are very poor compared to coastal California.
And I would say the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility, again, the former organization, I don't speak for them today, but during my tenure there, and the other San Luis Obispo major organization dealing with the San Luis Obispo Mothers for Peace, who were involved since 1969, mostly has their stated policy. Their mottos have been, who don't we like enough to send this to? And have believed it was a solution that had to be dealt with there by the community on site, and their organizations did not support.
Two little short comments. One is nuclear power will continue to be expanded because it is so profitable. It's better to, you know, for the banks, it's better for the construction industries and all that. And then on the flip side, on the tax side, I would say, could municipalities tax nuclear power generation companies for the airborne radiation that passes through their communities? They could pass legislation saying, hey, we measure this elevated airborne
So in Massachusetts at Plymouth, I believe, and in Minnesota at Prairie Island, the Midwalk. Not just for the emissions, but the fact that
The airborne emissions are measurable and ongoing.
Well, with that, I'd like to conclude. And did you have a quick question?
Well,
This will be really fast.
I wanted to
Because we're gonna
revisit
eat.
our,
Here, good, dear.
I'm Janet Garth from Nuclear Energy Information Service in Chicago, and I wanted to revisit Carmen's question about wildfires because, in particular, the Woolsey fire should have been named the Santa Susana fire because it actually started in Santa Susana, and which is a source of radiation. And I'd just like a comment on the wildfires that spread so much radiation, and particularly that one.
It wasn't Santa Susana didn't have a reactor there at one time?
It was in Southern California Edison. It was Southern California Edison. In fact, they have a newsreel where they show it on television. It was one of those Walter Cronkite or Edward R. Murrow See It Now. It's the first town in America lit with power from an electric. They throw a switch and the light bulb goes on. That was the experimental sodium reactor built and the event occurred in, was it July of 1959? And yes, it's a problem that the SMR reactors will have too. When you attempt to use liquid sodium as the cooling medium, it is, I mean, we know sodium. You did that science experiment, right? The science teacher takes it out of the jar and it becomes flammable in the presence of air and explosive when you put water on it. Well, they could not get and still have to design seals in the pumps that are required to pump this. That chemical that led to the problem there. So that wasn't necessarily a wildfire. It happened to have been a radioactive emission and meltdown in an area. Yes, there have been subsequent fires in the Santa Susana Hills. I think maybe back as far as 2008, 10, 12, we had some severe wildfires in there, and the concern was that the fires would then re-release material that had settled into the soil in the specific area. And so, yes, that was I believe, the Santa Susana incident which you referenced.
Well, with that, we're going to close this panel. I want to thank you again, David and Kim and James, for joining us today.
Thank you so much to our panelists and Dr. Pascoletti. We are now going to break for lunch. Lunch is served right outside of this room with different options for